Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for watching. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording later on, I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you getting involved. This week we're moving on to Module 3. We're moving on to some complex CSS selectors or some advanced CSS selectors. So we're just going to look at some more advanced ways to select different items. One of the things that we kind of talked about in the past when it comes to CSS selectors is basically specificity, right? How specific we can be when we're selecting different items. And that's a large part of this, is just kind of being as specific as possible. Another way that we can look at this is how we can select things that we might not usually be able to select in CSS. But as we get started today, just some reminders. We have our study hall on Thursday, 10:30 a.m., 3:30 p.m., room 3200 in Paxoy. If you are able to make it, I'll be hanging out. Come by and work or ask questions or just whatever you want to do. Not a requirement, but, just an opportunity that I give you all there. I think that's the only thing that I have kind of hanging out there as an announcement this week. So yeah, we'll just continue right along. As we want to start out, since we're talking about complex selectors here, I think the first thing I'd like to do is kind of remind us of our common selectors. Right? Our common selectors are things that we've covered in past classes. Right? If you've taken CTI 110, if you've taken Web 115, we've discussed our common selectors. And we basically have our three types of common selectors. These are our type, or we've also called these element selectors, class selectors, and ID selectors. Right? And so our type selector identifies an element based on its type or its element tag name. Right? So if we're using a paragraph, we would select something in CSS denoting the P for the paragraph P element tag. If it's a heading level 1, it would be H1. A main section, the word main, and so on and so forth. The class selector identifies an element based on its class attribute value. And we can use a class attribute on multiple elements as necessary to help kind of share styles among different elements on a web page. And then finally, our ID selector identifies kind of an element based on its ID attribute, which should be unique and only used on one element per HTML page. But just to kind of break that down again for us into just a nice little overview here. On our first line, we have our type or element selector. In this instance, it is an H1 type or element selector. And it selects an element by its type. Class selector, in our CSS, we denote a class selector by a period. In our HTML, we put class equals. And this selects our attribute by its class. And finally, we have our ID selector. In our CSS, we represent an ID selector with a hashtag, as we see here. In our HTML, it's represented as ID equals. Right, and so these are the common selectors. These are the ones that we've used kind of over and over and over and over again, right? Like these are the things that we introduced in CTI 110, that we reinforced in Web 115, and they're the common ways that we've done selections. But sometimes these don't really work for us, right? Like we can do a lot with these, but there are cases where maybe we can't add another class or ID attribute, or we need to be more specific about something that is in our CSS than just putting something here or there, right? And so in order to do that, we have some advanced selectors that allow us to get more specific or allow us to denote different relationships in the DOM. Right, so as we are working today, I have a file for us here. And this is the file that we'll be working on today. And we see that we have some different stuff that we can kind of be working with here today. This is our index.html file for our sample file that we'll be dealing with today. If we examine this index.html file, we see we have a lot of some more advanced markup in here. We see we have a nav. We have an ID class here of nav, or an ID of nav, an ID attribute of nav, not an ID class of nav. I saw the word class on the next line there and got them conflated. But there on the next line we see class. We also see some other interesting things here, right? Like we see this current page here. We'll talk more about what this is a little bit later on. But basically one of the interesting things that we can do with HTML is we get to make up our own attributes. Right? So if we want to highlight something as the current page that we are on, we could make up our own Boolean attribute of something called current page, and we could apply styles to that differently. We have some things that are referenced with targets here. Maybe we could do something with that. Maybe we could do something with hrefs. Maybe we could do something with our classes. That'd be a little bit different, right? We have a menu here that we're using. And so maybe we want to select different things in our menu. We have an H1 here. That's just an element. We have a header here at the top that contains our header for the entire site. We have a main section here with an article title in an H1, a section, a paragraph inside of that section that just has some dummy text in it, and a closing main tag there. So got some interesting stuff here. All right, so before we get into some of our advanced selectors, let's just remind ourselves of some of the typical selectors that we've been doing previously. First of all, like one of the things that we do most often, right, is to use our asterisk selector to reset some things. Right, so I'm going to come up here and use my asterisk selector to be my universal selector, my global selector, to select everything on my page. So in this case, I can add my font, -family, sans serif, and my box sizing, border box. Now everything on my page, since I use this asterisk selector here, will have these rules applied to it. Right? My asterisk is my wildcard, and we've done that here. Some other things that I can do with this here that I might want to do is like reset margin and padding. Right? Margin 0, padding 0, and this is something that we've talked about before. Right? We can just kind of reiterate this here as we're working with our margin and padding. If we reset the margin and padding on everything, then we get to control the margin and padding as we're kind of going through, which is a little practice that I like to do. Not a requirement, right? Like you can work with the basic styles that our browser provides by default, but if we reset everything, then we get complete control over everything. And one of the interesting things that we don't really bring up as much, that we need to bring up more, is the idea of 0, right? Because you'll see me enter 0. When I enter 0, I'll just enter 0. But when we enter some other value, we need to enter the unit with it, whether it's a percentage, a rem, a m, a pixel, whatever it is. Right? And that's because my browser recognizes 0 as nothing. Right? 0%, 0 rem, 0 m, 0 viewport height, 0 vmin, 0 anything is nothing. It's 0. right? So it doesn't really matter which unit we give 0. We can add a unit to it, but it doesn't really matter which unit that we're using because 0 is 0 is 0 is 0. But if we use some other number, we need to specify our unit because 12 pixels and 12% is very, very different, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks. So now we have this reset. We can look at our site here now. Let's pull up the live site here. That's what we're dealing with. We can see we have no margin, no padding. We have our nav here at the top. We might want to do some stuff with that. For example, we can see our nav. We have a menu here of nav. So we can focus our nav ID. So in here, that's hashtag nav. And we can list dash style type is none here to get rid of those disks in that list. Right? So our hashtag nav here relates to our ID equals nav here in with our ID attribute. And once we've done that, it's removed those disks from my list item there. Just a few other examples. We can look at our, for example, let's see, where's one of those classes at? Let's see, we used a class here, we used a class here. Let's put a class on our H1 here just so we can have a class equals, let's say dark red, DRK, RED, and we'll pick a dark red color to kind of go onto this. So now, like all of our H1s or any text that we want to be dark red, we can add this same class to it. So in our CSS, we can apply a .drk red and just add a color of some kind of color that would be a nice dark red. So let's go for something like a hashtag 541200 and give ourselves a nice, that might even be too dark because it's hard to see on screen there. Let's lighten that up just a little bit. Let's go like to 85. Brighten that up a bit. Make it stand out just a little bit more so you can see it a little bit better here. So now we have a nice dark red here, a nice dark red here. We applied that as a class. We've done a lot of stuff here. Now, one of the things that I might want to do is I might want to take these list items that are in this menu, that are a part of this one menu, and style them up to look like a menu. So one of the easy ways that we would do this, first of all, right, is we could, do something that we were talking about kind of last week, and we can add a little display grid here, and add a little grid template here. Which would be repeat 4,1 frame. Did I remember to do it in the right order this week? Let's find out. I sure did. Right, but there are still some issues here. Right, we've got this kind of looking good, looking right. We have it gridded out. If we look at our inspect element here, we can look at our box model. We can see that it's auto based on the fact that it is an inline element still. But we have this grid for each list item that is some amount that is changing based on the size of the window, which looks pretty good. But there's some other stuff that's an issue here, right? Like maybe I want to center up the text in here, right? That might be something I want to do, or maybe I want to just do some other stuff with these links here that make them a little more, styled up. Maybe I want to make this link text a little smaller for some reason, or maybe I want to add some padding to these list items, and I want to select these list items a little more specifically so as to, not interfere with any other lists I might add to this page later on, right? Because if I used just the list item tag here, I would cause myself a problem, right? Because, just using list item here would take any list item on my page and impact all of those list items. I could put a class in all of my list items that I wanted to change and make different. I could do that, right? But in this instance, we have 4 items that are making up our navigation, but we might have a dozen items that are making up our navigation, and that would be just way too many. So in an instance like that, one of the things that we might want to do is utilize a child selector. Right, so we know the parent. We know the parent of this element. And so we can use a child selector in CSS to provide a way to select elements that fall within a parent. Right, so I can take a parent and say, okay, any child that's a part of that parent. So we have a specifically addressed parent here, right? ID nav, hashtag nav, a specific address on the parent that we can use to address with that. And so we can say, okay, well, any list items that are inside the hashtag nav parent, we can do something special with those. That way we don't have to get really fancy into declaring classes in all of our list items or doing something weird with how we select all of that stuff. So we can use a complex CSS selector or as a child selector here. Now there are multiple different ways that we can do this here. One is to use a Descendant Selector, and one is to use a direct child selector. And our Descendant Selector looks just like this, right? We just have a space between the parent and the child. Right, if we look here, we have the parent and the child. So the most common child selector is the Descendant Selector, which matches every element that follows an identified ancestor. So every H2, in our example here, every H2 that follows an article, that is inside of an article, would gain the rules that are put inside of this declaration block. They don't have to come directly inside of that element. They could be buried within it. Right? So one of the things that we could do here is we could impact our links like this. Right? Let's head over and let's check that out. We could impact our links in this sort of way. Right? So I could create a hashtag nav here as the parent selector, and then I could put my A here next. So that's space A. Let me zoom into that so you all can see that just a little bit better. So all we're saying here when we do this is we're saying, okay, any link that is somewhere inside of an element on our page that has a hashtag nav, right? And then we can start to do some decorations to it, right? For example, if we wanted to make it bolder, right? Font -weight bold. We could also change the color here, right? Color Let's go something that's a little lighter than this, but not too much lighter. So we can get a little bit of contrast there. Maybe something like a hashtag A02400 or something like that, maybe. Or maybe we can even go for something like a pink. Let's try something like a something like that. Right, and so this is going to affect the links that are inside of my nav. And if we look at that, we see exactly that, right? We see now these links here, they've changed color. They're bolder now. And they're that red color. And so if they're anywhere at all inside of our hashtag nav container here, which is our menu container here, even if they're a child of another element like our links are here, then just using that space to separate the item allows us to select those elements directly, which gives us a little more flexibility. The other item that you've seen me use before as a child selector is our direct descendant selector, which is the greater than symbol. Right? We'll throw that slide up in just a second, but if I put a greater than symbol here, then that means that the A has to be directly inside of the parent. It can't be nested in another container. Right? So if I saved that, we could go back here and we could see now that those links have lost that styling. Right? Because they're not directly in there. So they're just somewhere in that DOM block somewhere. Right, which is pretty cool. We can do a lot of interesting selection stuff with that. You could probably sit there and think about how you could apply things to that and work with that, right? Like a lot of really interesting stuff going on. Our other option here is going to be, as we've kind of mentioned, to use our direct child selector. So our direct child selector, we can kind of, sometimes there's too many things. Right? Like you can have things nested within things, and you might not want all those other things, right? You might just want things that are on the same level as the direct descendant of the parent. Right, so if we think about our DOM, we have our parent, and then we have the next level in, and we might just want to select those things. That's our direct child selector, and that's our greater than symbol, like we've talked about there. So at times, so the direct child selector, we place that greater than symbol between the parent and the direct child, and as we just saw in our demonstration there, that means that only the things that come immediately next inside of the DOM, if they meet those qualifications, then they will be able to be changed by these selectors. So we can see this example here. Of a direct child selector. We have an article and a paragraph in an article here. Our article in this instance has a paragraph inside of it. if we were to check out our example here of what we're working with, an example that we could do with this would be our list items. So we could use our hashtag nav here, greater than list items, and we could do things like text dash align center. We could add some padding. Maybe we could add something like 20. Or let's add some rim. Like let's add like 1.4 rim and 0. Right, so we'll add some top and bottom padding and no side to side padding. Right, just so we get a nice little menu here at the top. If we wanted to make sure, for example, we selected our H1 that's in our header. Although we could save that for let's do something a little bit different with that. Like, although I would probably use the direct child selector for that if I were doing it in the real world, let's save our next selector for that, to center up the header and make it big here. But while we're at it, let's go ahead and just add a little bit more to kind of what we're doing here, right? So we can look at our header, which in this instance is the whole top here. Maybe add a little border bottom to the header. So we'll just use our element selector here to give us another example of border dash bottom, 12 pixels, solid, and we'll use an even darker red, and that'll be our last color that we'll kind of pull out of this. Maybe something like that. So we've got that there. We'll do some other stuff with it along the way, right? We're just kind of working on a little site here. Right, but we see here, you know, things that are kind of a little bit different. All right, we're selecting things in a little bit of a different manner. We've introduced our descendant selector if it's anywhere down the lineage from child down to, you know, great, 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 forever great grandchild. We can just put a space between the root ancestor of that element and the thing that we're looking for, and it will find that all the way down through the DOM. If we want just direct descendants, we use our greater than symbol to find list items. So what if we want to find siblings, right? Which is what I want to do here. What if I want to reference this H1 in relation to its brother or sister, right? So in this instance, that might be the sibling here would be the menu, right? Our hashtag nav here again. So I do have a sibling selector that I can use for this that we can look at here. And our sibling selector is the tilde key. It's the, you know, it's the key shift and the key over the tab. Right? This is the general sibling selector. So this is going to go through, it can find any sibling that's on the same level as any other element or that's on the same level as the first element in the CSS here. So in our example that we have displayed here, right, we have H2, the little tilde, and then the letter, our paragraph tag. So this is for any paragraph that is on the same level in terms of the DOM as our heading level 2s. Right, any paragraphs that share the same parent as the heading level 2s in our document. And now this is going to go throughout our document, right? Like if they share different parents in different areas, that's fine, right? Just so long as they share the same parent, it's going to have the same impact. So we can see that in our example here. If we work with this, right, we have this ID nav here that is a sibling with our H1 here. They share the header parent. So we can use our hashtag nav, our tilde, and our H1 to do some selection here. Now we do have more than one H1 on our page. Right, if we look at our document here, this is an H1 and also this is an H1. Right, but only one of those H1s shares a parent with our nav menu. So we can go in here and we can change some stuff with this one if we want to, right? Since we have our sibling selector in here, it will only change the one that is siblings with the nav ID element, or the element with the nav ID, which is our menu item that's in the header of this document. So we can, text dash align center. We can font size 5 VH or VW. Right, and when we do that, what we see is we have this nice big title here. And this one is staying exactly the same size. They're both still H1s. Only this one is the only one that is the sibling to our navigation up here. The only one that shares a parent with our navigation up here. So it's the only one that these rules with our complex selector here apply to. Right? So one of the things that we might want to do here as well is just maybe add a little padding to this. Right? Padding, maybe 1.2 rem. And 0, just so we can kind of see that in action there with a little bit of padding. Right, a navigation across the top, a very simple navigation. A website title, some padding. We're doing interesting stuff, and we're not adding a whole bunch of extra classes and IDs and all this other sort of stuff. Right, that's the big thing about all this, is we're using these complex selectors to be more specific in what we're selecting without adding a bunch of frivolous classes and IDs. Right, we don't need them in these instances, right? Another thing that we could do here is we could use our adjacent sibling selector. Adjacent sibling selector uses the plus sign, so any sibling that shares a parent with the first element in the list is what we do for our sibling selectors. But with our adjacent sibling selector, it's only if the next item is such a thing. Right? Only if the element that directly follows this element is the other element title, then it'll work. Right? Otherwise, we'd need to be a little more, or a little less specific, rather, and use just the regular sibling selector with that. Now, we can see that in our example that we've been kind of working with here, right? We just had something that uses an adjacent sibling. Right? If we look in our menu here, we can see that the next item after our nav here is our H1. So if we were to switch this tilde here to a plus sign for our adjacent sibling selector, that's still going to work. Right? We can still see the changes here. Now, where we get into a little bit of difference is when we get into things like this. Like, let's say we want to change up this paragraph a little bit. Or what do I have here? Yeah, because we have a section and an H1 and an article. Let's add another paragraph here, just so you all can see it. I'm going to just copy the paragraph that we have here, and I am going to paste it or actually, let me copy this whole section here and let me paste it outside of that section. And so now we have two different sections that are siblings to an H1. So now I can come back in my CSS and I can say, okay, well, H1 plus adjacent sibling selector section color orange, just so we can see what this does, right? So if we use our plus sign here for the adjacent sibling selector, we can see that only that first section, the one that comes immediately after the heading, is orange. If we use our tilde, which is just our sibling selector, then any section that shares the parent will be colored orange, like so. I think in this instance, one of the things that we can do, just so we can have an example of that, is maybe make this font a little bit bigger. So we can say maybe font size, maybe 1.2 rem, maybe line height 1.4 rem, right? We can just change that stuff there. And so now we can see that a little bit in there. Maybe make that a little bit bigger with a little bit, maybe add a little more line height there, like so. And we could also add, maybe a little more padding to this first paragraph here using our adjacent sibling selector. So maybe that would be H1 plus section padding or margin bottom 2 rem. Now we have that extra margin. If we looked beneath our second paragraph here, and we could do that if we use our inspect tool, right? Using our inspect tool on our first paragraph, or on our first section rather, we see that we have some margin underneath it. If we look at our second section, we see there's no margin underneath it because we use the direct sibling tool to add that in there, which is pretty cool. Another thing that we could do here, right, if we wanted to only say that, the main that's directly after the heading, or the header rather, is a certain way. Right? Main that follows, or the header with a main that follows it, is a width of 75%, margin 0 auto. We get that all centered up now. We could also, background. We can add some padding on that. Padding of, say, 1.5 rem. Background color of white. And then just on our body, add a background color of black, right? Just so we can really see things kind of pop out to us here. Right, so we might want to add a white here to our header, right? Just as we're working here. So let's do that while we're working. Background color white. And there's our site as it stands. Right, we've got a nav, we've got some interesting stuff here. Let's get a little bit fancier. Let's get a little bit more advanced. Right, we're doing some really wild stuff here now. Let's try out some attribute selectors. Some attribute selectors. So we can look for an attribute on a particular element, and if that attribute is present, then we can style it differently, which is pretty cool. Right? So some of the common selectors that we've kind of looked at, we can also kind of define them as attribute selectors. And we can make up an attribute, which is kind of cool. So when we're thinking about whether or not an attribute is present, we could just make up an attribute. So the first attribute selector kind of identifies an attribute based on whether or not just it's there, regardless of any actual value. And so in this instance, we can just kind of select an element and include the attribute name in square brackets within a selector. And so if we do that, the square brackets may or may not follow any qualifier, such as an element type or class, depending on, any specificity. Right? So we can just use these attribute selectors just with absolutely anything else, right? Like if we look at this example here, in this instance, we are looking for any element that has a target added onto it. Any element that has a target onto it. We can add any link element that has a target added onto it. We can do whatever with it. All right, if we look at our example that we're working on here, let's look through our HTML here. And we can see a lot of different stuff. We see the target attribute here. Let me add a different one. Which would be kind of interesting. Right, in in HTML, there's an ABBR tag, and ABBRs have titles for them. So let's add an ABBR tag here, ABBR for abbreviation. Title here would be, how we would spell out the abbreviation. So it might be something like even, listening is timely. I don't know. Just to kind of make something up here for elit. Surround that there. Now by default we can look here, we can see we have elit here. It's got a little dotted line underneath it. And if we hover over it, we can see that we get the tooltip pop up. So what I want to do is I want to select any element that has a title element to it, because we've added a title attribute to this here. So I can use my asterisk selector that we've used before for everything. But then in between square brackets, I can put my syntax that we were looking at here. In this case, we're just going to put title, T-I-T-L-E, T-I-T-L-E. And from there, I can put curly braces and add some rules here. Maybe I want to put color of, maybe we can make this the same color that we've made our links here. Maybe we want to change the cursor to be pointer. Right, so now if we save that, we see, if we look closely here, right? There it is. It has that title tag. It's changed to red now. And if we hover over it, now it's got the pointer instead of the cursor the way it did before, to give us a better affordance. And we know that we can check that out. And so anything that we would use the ABBR, or anything that we would have a title tag at all on from this point forward, would work with that. Another thing that I wanted to kind of point out here, in our index.html here, I gave us this current page custom selector. Right, so if we look, we can also do custom attribute selectors by just putting that in there, right? It can be absolutely anything. So in this instance here, I have made this custom selector here. It is called current-page. So if I wanted to take any link that had current-page and make it maybe not look like a link. So color black, text, decoration, none. Or maybe I wanted to kind of maybe invert this one. In particular, let's get a little bit fancy with it. Right, so maybe I wanted to say, okay, well, maybe color white. And maybe my background color is A03232. And I'd also want to be able to get the parent of that as well. And so this is actually a new CSS tag, our parent selector tag. which I haven't even put into this presentation because that's how new it is. Right, we did not learn parent last year. And so this is a has pseudo selector. So in this instance, what I would do is I would say, okay, I'm going to look for a list item. I'm going to look for a list item that has a link that has the element of current page. And then from there, I'm going to give that the same background color. And actually, in this instance, since I'm doing that here, I can take away that background color here. All right, so now if we save this, we can look at our page. Oh shoot, what did I do incorrectly here? That is definitely how that's supposed to work. First time I've pulled out the notes today. Let's have a look at those. Something it doesn't like here. Did I typo? Let's just try another one of our let's try our target selector here just to see if that will help us any, because we know that it works. We know this works. Oh yeah, something's gone wonky here. You know what? It's okay. We'll leave it in there. That should work. It might just be an issue with my live server right now. We could try to stop the live server and restart the live server. See what that does. Let's inspect here for a minute and see why this isn't working, or maybe if we can learn something here. Okay, so it's seeing it. Why is it not employing that rule? Oh, that's what it is. Okay, it's because that is a higher level of specificity. So I need to, in my CSS here, instead of I need to make sure I'm doing hashtag nav a current page and hashtag nav a current page here, I believe. All right, we're a little closer here. And we could probably put our hashtag nav here. Hashtag nav li has. Because now it's there, it's just black and white. How did we style that list item? We did a direct. This is one place where this all gets challenging. And has is new, so it might not even show up here. It might not be available in my browser here yet. Let's do a can I use it? Can I use has? Let's see if I can find my current version of Opera here, see if it'll tell me. I am on Opera version 90. And check this out, everybody. I need Opera version 91 to use has. So that's why has isn't working here. That's how new has is. So I'm going to leave that there with the assumption that it will be working when I update my browser. Let's do a couple more things really quickly here, just so we can have them done. Or you know what? I think since we are at the 1 hour mark here, I think I will leave you all to discover the rest on your own. We've done an absolute ton in our hour together today, so we will leave it at that for today. What you have left to kind of discover is our structural and positional pseudo classes, so things like First child, last child, only child. First of type, last of type, only of type. First letter pseudo class or pseudo selector, which we can do first letters really quickly. Like if we wanted to select the first letter of our paragraphs and make them really big, we could use our first letter pseudo selector. So let's find where we've selected a paragraph here, so we can select it the same way. Or actually, we haven't really done that here. So we can say paragraph P, : first dash letter. And we can just make that font dash size 2 rem. And that'll make the first letter bigger in our paragraphs, like that, for like a little drop cap, right? Which is kind of fun. There's also a before and after property, which is kind of fun, that maybe we'll do something else on, but it's something that you can kind of work through. So that's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know, and we will see you next time.